A Kupo and a Que to all my Final Fantasy fans out there, and welcome to Risky Business. This episode is all about Final Fantasy III, not the one on the Super Nintendo, not the 3D remaster on the DS and the PSP and Steam, but instead, we're talking about the original Famicom release, Final Fantasy III, that was originally released only in Japan. Thank you so much to the folks at Chaos Rush for this excellent translation. I strongly recommend it, and I'll put a link to the translation patch down in the comments below. Before we get started, I wanted to address really quickly in a previous video, I made a mistake, and I quoted the often repeated urban legend regarding the first Final Fantasy game. Square was not going out of business, and Final Fantasy did not save the company. That's an urban legend, and Sakaguchi himself, not that long ago in an interview, set the record straight, saying, while those were somewhat difficult times, he would have called the game really anything, as long as it had the initials F. It wasn't like the Hail Mary pass to save the company. I talk about that a lot more on my podcast, and I'll put a link to that as well, but in the meanwhile, let's rock and roll with Final Fantasy III. Released in April 1990 for the Famicom in Japan, Final Fantasy III was the first game in the franchise to feature the job system, which would allow the player to collect new character classes and change the class of each of their 4 characters on the fly. This is a very crude version of that system, but we'll dive deeper to that in just a few minutes. Sadly, this particular Final Fantasy wouldn't be localized until a 3D remake was released on the Nintendo DS in 2006. While sales of the original Final Fantasy were stronger in North America than they were in Japan, both this and Final Fantasy II were released too late in the NES lifecycle to be localized in time to beat the release of the Super Nintendo. And Nintendo of America wanted to focus on their new system instead of new games for their old machine. It was just as well, since Square really didn't have adequate manpower to localize Final Fantasy III anyway. A WonderSwan color upgrade was planned in the early 2000s, but this proved to be far too challenging an ordeal. According to Hiromichi Tanaka, who was Vice President of Software Development at Square at the time, the game was too complex to recreate on the handheld system. The WonderSwan color cartridge simply didn't have the storage space required to recreate the game in a 16-bit format. Final Fantasy III is so jam-packed, in fact, that it is the second largest cartridge on the console, weighing in at an impressive 512 kilobytes, 4 times the capacity of a typical NES cartridge. In case you're curious, the largest is the visual novel Metal Slater Glory. With graphics by Amano and music by Uematsu, the presentation here is excellent. You may be surprised to see a lot of graphics that look like earlier versions of what would come in 4 and 5, especially in towns and castles. The job system is complemented by a variety of different character models, and they're not reused to create NPCs, each of whom have their own map and menu sprite. There's a shocking amount of color and detail even in the enemy sprites, although palette swaps do become frequent toward the end of the game. The music is of course top-notch here, as expected from the master Uematsu himself, but many themes are repeated often. That's most likely just due to the massive size of the game and all the assets that it contains, and is by no means a discredit to Uematsu himself. This would be the last Square game programmed by the legendary Nasir Jebeli, whose work visa would expire during its development. Nasir returned to California and finished working on the game there. Nasir would go on to program Secret of Mana and then enjoy an early retirement. Nasir actually was involved in a lot of amazing projects in the early days of DOS game development, and there's even an interview he did with Romero that talks a lot about the things he did in the early days. He was a very accomplished programmer who did a lot of impressive things back in the 80s and 90s. Final Fantasy III was of course directed by the father of Final Fantasy, the international treasure, Hironobu Sakaguchi. The same creative team stayed on from the first 2 games, and Sakaguchi co-wrote the story with returning scenario writer Kenji Terada. This time around, instead of giving the protagonist a group of characters with distinct personalities, The player characters are something of a blank slate. There are some attempts at giving them dialogue, but they aren't generally assigned to a specific character, and on top of that, it's rather scarce. Instead, the supporting cast moves the story along. Each chapter of the quest introduces a character who will tag along with the player for a brief time, providing extra story context along the way, providing the player remembers to press the B button to speak to them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this sort of deep dive documentary style video, please like and subscribe. I have a lot of great content here about Final Fantasy, Castlevania, and all different retro games. So please check out my back catalog of videos for lots more, and turn on those notifications so you don't miss my next one. The story returns to the crystal motif of the original Final Fantasy, with the 4 elemental crystals that control the forces of nature falling out of balance, resulting in catastrophic circumstances for the world. The player controls 4 orphans who, upon falling into a chasm created by an earthquake, receive special powers from the Earth Crystal and are told to fulfill the prophecy of restoring balance to the world. They are then unceremoniously sent out into the world at large to find and eliminate the source of the corruption. They'll receive tons of help along the way from a number of characters, most importantly Doga and Une, students of the great magus Noah, who is never seen on screen in the game. They reveal that while Noah gave them magical powers as gifts, their fellow student Xande was given the gift of mortality, and has decided to use the powers of the crystals to escape death. He had successfully taken the power of both the earth and water crystals, causing the imbalance that created the Light Warriors. As Xande continues draining the crystals, it is revealed that a second set of 4 crystals, the Dark Crystals, also exist, each one holding the spirit of a warrior of darkness. This echoes the theme of balance between not only the forces of nature, but also the 2 sides of light and dark. This was a recurring theme in the early Final Fantasy games, as you recall from the first Final Fantasy, in which the player is literally an agent of order, trying to restore balance in the world in the presence of chaos. Xande's draining of the earth and water crystals leads to the game's most striking feature, the presence of 3 distinct world maps. It's revealed shortly into the game that the orphans live on a floating continent far above the world, and they have to travel to the main world to confront Xande. The third map is an underwater map, a lot like what we would see years later in Final Fantasy VII. There's no mini-map though. You have to use a Dwarven Bread or the Sight spell in order to look at the world map. To travel these 3 classic-style overworld maps, the Light Warriors will use a variety of methods: chocobos, a canoe, and several airships, one of which, the Nautilus, can become a submarine. The final vessel is a large ship called the Invincible. It's the first Final Fantasy vehicle to act as a mobile base, complete with a free bed, some unmanned shops, and even the fat chocobo, who can be summoned elsewhere throughout the game world by using Gasol greens. And you will need his help. Your inventory space is very limited, and it fills up fast. Final Fantasy III loves to load you up with consumable items that cast spells, and you'll have to unequip all of your gear when you want to change jobs. The job system here is very much an elementary version, with no prerequisites to change jobs and no option to carry over abilities from one job to another. Job levels merely increase available magic to applicable classes, and reduce the number of capacity points needed to change to another similar job. That's it. The only requirement to change jobs is having enough capacity points. These cap at 255, and the more extreme the job change, the more points are consumed. They can be regained by defeating enemies. Each of the 4 orphans has slightly different stats, but their overall stats are determined by their job and the character experience level. So it makes it feel like every time you change jobs, it's almost like you're swapping in a completely different character of the same experience level. In this game, magic users have a pen and paper style magic point system in which they have a given number of points per spell level, and each spell consumes 1 point. However, they do get a much larger number of points per level than in the original Final Fantasy. Magic users also have surprisingly good survivability here. While they still have to live in the back row in order to avoid taking heavy damage, their hit points aren't that much lower than that of your melee characters. You can change rows both inside and out of battles, and you're going to be doing that a lot, because back attacks are frequent here, especially in dungeons, and it is exhausting. I was mentally worn out after running through some of these dungeons. Whew. Hey, if you're still with me, I really appreciate it. Do me a favor, please watch all the way to the end of this video. Watch time is one of the most important metrics that the YouTube algorithm looks at in order to determine whether a video should be pushed or not. So if you can watch and listen till the very end, that's going to help me tremendously in getting my content out in front of more people. Thank you. In case you were wondering, monk classes are still overpowered and thief is still completely useless. His major utility is the ability to pick locks, which is kind of cool, but you can replace that just by buying keys in a shop. Remarkably, this is the first time in a Final Fantasy game that we'll see different abilities for the different jobs. It's very cool to see the origin of the Dragoon's jump ability, the thief's ability to steal items in game, the archer's ability to aim, the monk building up power. Really great to see this in an 8-bit game. That just goes to show how far they came since the original Final Fantasy was released. On the other hand, the job system is treated like a gimmick, and it can be kind of annoying sometimes. Each of the crystals is supposed to provide upgrades for your jobs, but it's not always clear what the upgrade would be. A lot of the secondary jobs can use magic, but it's always capped at a low level, so you're really better off just keeping your mages as mages until you get the more powered up versions of the mages, but that doesn't happen until like a lot later in the game. There are also a few sections that try to force you to change jobs, but in this most recent playthrough I learned that it's possible to get through a lot of those areas without changing jobs if you're just really careful about how you play. On the upside, there's not a lot of grinding here. I found myself at an acceptable level to face pretty much any given challenge most of the time. The downside is that the random encounter rate can be really high sometimes, especially in the later dungeons. While I found most of this game to be pretty easy, the finale is, by contrast, incredibly difficult. The final dungeon is actually 4 dungeons, and 2 of them have to be completed back to back, with only 1 chance to save in between, and you can't go back to your ship. Also, once you enter the final dungeon, you can't leave. You can't save, there are no recovery springs, there's only like 25 Phoenix Downs and 25 elixirs in the whole entire game, and in that last dungeon there are 5 different bosses to beat. And the end boss is super broken. It just spams the same spell over and over again. It's a really boring and underwhelming final battle, and it was so disappointing after playing the game to have such a boring final battle. Now, while ATB had not yet been created for this game, the battles do move along a lot faster than the previous 2 games, and for the first time here you'll see the damage and healing numbers popping out of the characters, rather than in dialogue boxes below. It's a much smoother experience, and it doesn't feel as painful or laborious as the earlier games. You can also adjust the battle speed at the game load menu. You can also select up to 3 different save files there, which is a huge quality of life improvement. Speaking of quality of life improvements, you can just hold the A button during battles, and that'll auto-select the attack option for each character, so you get through those random encounters a lot faster than you otherwise might. Another great technical advancement here is that missile weapons play a huge role, but because arrows are consumable, inventory management can become a real nightmare, and you may find your archers throwing punches if you aren't careful. As always, you can use some weapons to cast spells, but the effect is usually so poor that it really isn't worthwhile. Instead of each status spell being assigned an elemental property, they simply have a base chance of success modified by the target's resistance. While virtually any spell can be cast on multiple targets, the effectiveness is reduced so dramatically that it's hardly worth doing. On the upside, any class can equip a weapon in each hand. This makes shields pretty much useless since even warriors can dual wield and do completely absurd amounts of damage. Once you get to about the halfway point of the game, or maybe a little farther, your knight character is doing so much damage it's ridiculous. This means shields will clutter up your already limited inventory, so you'll find yourself going to shops to sell items pretty often. You can sell items at any shop, conveniently located inside every inn, but don't look for tents or cabins, they don't exist in this game. Phoenix Down can't be purchased at shops. They're only in chests. There are only about 25 of them in the entire game, the same with elixirs. But on the plus side, there are recovery springs in a lot of the dungeons, so that's pretty helpful. You can find them in a few unexpected places. While the weapon and armor shops will show you which character can use an item, it doesn't indicate whether it's an improvement over the existing item. You also obtain spells by purchasing and using an item. Now if you make a mistake and use an item to learn a spell that you didn't want for that character, there's no need to worry. You can turn any spell back into an item, or even swap entire spell lists. The menus here really are a huge improvement compared to the previous games. Equipping weapons and armor can feel like a chore because a piece of equipment has to be removed before a new one can be equipped, and that can be a real problem if your inventory is getting full, and it's a little tedious also. You'll find that Final Fantasy III has a ton of secret passages, a feature we would see again in Final Fantasy IV. You can get some great treasure this way, but it's also required in order to get to where you're going in some places. If only these passages could get us around some of the parts of the game where you have to cast Mini or Toad on your whole party in order to proceed. These are entirely too frequent, and sometimes you can turn right back after going through a door. So the whole point of that is to make you waste 2 magic points. Unique to Final Fantasy III are battles on the airship, but only in certain areas. What's cool about that is when you get on the Invincible, it'll actually fire a cannon at the enemies and do about like 300 damage to each enemy, which I think is pretty cool. I like that. I thought it was a nifty little feature. When you consider how jam-packed this game is with all the assets and data, having a little extra like that definitely goes above and beyond the expectation. Final Fantasy III has a number of firsts for the franchise. You'll encounter dancing girls in towns, you'll be turned into a toad, you'll even play the piano. You'll meet a couple of Moogles at one point, but in the original version of the game, they didn't say Kupo, they said Nyah. You can have a summoner in your party, and you'll fight Bahamut, Leviathan, and Odin to learn to summon them to help you in battle, and you'll both cast and be hit with the Meteor spell, the most powerful black magic in the game, which as we might recall becomes a really big deal in the following game. Final Fantasy III was very well received. As of 2003, 1.4 million copies have been sold, and the game received a 36 out of 40 rating from the publication that would eventually be called Famitsu, narrowly losing Game of the Year to Dragon Quest IV. In 2006, Famitsu readers voted Final Fantasy III the 8th best game of all time among some pretty sturdy company. Now, this used to be my least favorite Final Fantasy, but I had a lot of fun on this last playthrough, so I may have to reconsider that. I didn't find the story all that gripping, and not having personalities for the main characters after 2 feels like a downgrade. The job system feels flimsy, and these frequent mandatory changes are disruptive to the flow of the game. So are the Mini and Toad sections. The very small inventory makes managing it a real pain in the neck, but the graphics, the music, and the upgraded gameplay from the previous Final Fantasies make this game such a treat in so many ways, and it really does show the absolute top tier of what the NES or the Famicom is capable of. Now, if you haven't played the original Final Fantasy III, I definitely do recommend it, but be ready for a challenge once you get to the end. I want to thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you very much if you stuck out to the end. Now, if you stuck out to the end, do me a favor in the comment section, please tell me your favorite Final Fantasy game. It can be any of the mainline entries, or it could be Tactics, or even one of the side stories like Type 0, or any of those side Final Fantasy games. I found that a lot of those are real sleeper games, like Brave Exvius is very cool. So a lot of these are a lot of fun, and they get forgotten about. Dissidia is another great example. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. That helps me out a lot. And that algorithm, man, that algorithm is harder on me than the Cloud of Darkness is on the Light Warrior. So help me out, throw me a comment, like, subscribe, enable notifications, and you will not miss it when I cover Final Fantasy IV in an upcoming video. My next video is going to be all about Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. That's going to be a really fun title to go over. And I have Castlevania and Final Fantasy retrospectives kind of as the meat and potatoes of the channel here, so please check that out. Lots of other retro gaming content coming, some tutorials, and even some gameplay footage and stuff if you're into that. Thank you once again, and until next time, game over. Whew.